My charge for the next couple of days will be on scientific evidence for God and for creation. And this afternoon's lesson is about extra-biblical scientific evidence. That is, we're not going to look at scientific principles discussed in the Bible as much as exterior to the Bible. But then tomorrow night at 7, I'll have the second half of mine in which we will look at Bible passages where scientific principles are mentioned, and we'll talk about the evidence that we find there. So, the word science itself is a very powerful word in our society. Science for a lot of people is looked at as if it were practically a divine matter. But the scientific method and scientific discovery can be defined as this: the intellectual and practical activity encompassing the systematic study of the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world through observation and experiment. Sean talked about that somewhat in his earlier lesson. But as we consider the scientific method, some people say, well, you have science and it's in favor of evolution. And then you have the Bible and it's in favor of God. Well, the reality is that is not true. But rather, there are many scientific evidences that would point in the direction of God and point in the direction of creation. And the Bible itself reveals to us that would be the case. If you'll turn to Romans chapter 1, Bruce alluded to this in his lesson this morning. Romans chapter 1, beginning with verse 18. As Paul writes about the condition of the non-Jewish world and their sinfulness, their idolatry, their lack of following God, he points out several things. But beginning with verse 18 it says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Because that which is known about God is evident within them. For God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. For even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man and of birds, four-footed animals, and crawling creatures." And he goes on from there and talks about the moral decline of those who reject knowledge of the true God. This passage tells us so much, but what it does not teach us is this idea of blind faith that we've been discussing. This is not about just believe because you want to believe. This is faith based in evidence. Verse 19, it talks about things about God that can be known, things that God has made evident. He's shown them to be the way that they are, so that in verse 20, the creation itself declares the invisible attributes of God. I love the phraseology when it says his invisible attributes, verse 20, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen. You can see these things about God as you look at what God made, as you observe the creation. And again, this is not a discussion of religion versus science. This is a discussion of science being done properly and whether or not it would point toward God and toward creation, or whether scientific discovery done properly would point away. Where does the evidence lead? That's what we're looking at as we talk about these things. And the reality is, when you talk about science and when you talk about religion, many famous scientists of years gone by, as well as many famous scientists today, have been believers in God and in creation. Not all of them, but many of them have been. Consider for a moment Leonardo da Vinci, known as an inventor, known as a scientist, but also a believer in a creator God. Robert Boyle, who is one of the founders of modern chemistry, and he was a believer in creation and a believer in God. Isaac Newton, brilliant mathematician, involved in studies of astronomy and gravity. He was a scientist. to the ultimate degree, yet Isaac Newton firmly believed in a creator God. Even Albert Einstein himself, we'll say more about him later, even Albert Einstein himself, in the realm of physics, the best known name, yet he himself believed there had to be something beyond the physical realm, some divine essence that would bring all of this to be what it is. Now, perhaps one you haven't heard of, but Stephen Meyer is another. He's Cambridge educated. Notice a couple of quotations from him as he talks about scientific discovery in modern times and how that these point more toward God than they do away from belief in a creator God. Stephen Meyer says, I believe that the testimony of science supports theism. While there will always be points of tension or unresolved conflict, the major developments in science in the past 5 decades, this is a fairly recent quote, by the way, in the last 5 decades have been running in a strongly theistic direction. He paused momentarily. Then he punched his conclusion. Science done right points toward God. So here's a man, a brilliant scientist, Cambridge educated, and he says that even in the last 5 decades, scientific discovery has pointed more toward God rather than against. And again, as Sean pointed out, this is not about absolute proof. I can't come up here and say that, okay, absolute proof, here it is. But what I can say is, look at the evidence. Put the evidence in the scale. And does the evidence weigh more toward belief in God? Or does the evidence weigh more against belief in God? I would say to you this afternoon that when we look at some very well-known scientific principles, that these matters point toward God, not away from Him. And when you think about it, if God truly is the creator of the universe, then all proper scientific study that is done will point toward Him, not away from Him, because He is the author of this universe. The first I'll mention to you this afternoon is the first law of thermodynamics. I know you talk about this all the time. Well, okay, maybe not. But the first law of thermodynamics goes something like this. It is the idea that matter and energy can neither be created nor destroyed. Now, they can be transformed from one form into another, but matter and energy can neither be created nor be destroyed. So, in other words, the first law of thermodynamics says we have matter, we have energy, and you can take, for example, the caterpillar who goes to the cocoon, who comes forth as the butterfly. Now, in these cases, the matter and the energy that's involved in the existence of the caterpillar, the matter and energy did not cease to exist, but what did happen to them is they were transformed by stages from one form into another. And that is a good representation of what the first law of thermodynamics says. Now consider this. If it is true that matter and energy can neither be created nor destroyed, and that they are merely transformed from one form into another, what does that tell us? Well, we know that matter and energy are not eternal. Even the evolutionary scientists would tell you that matter and energy are not eternal. They had to have a beginning point somewhere. But since there's no scientific principle that would allow for the idea of matter or energy being eternal, and they can't be created or destroyed, then what that tells us is there had to be a non-physical cause for their existence. And my friends, that cause we know in Scripture as Yahweh, Jehovah God. Look in Hebrews chapter 1. Scripture speaks to the idea of the first law of thermodynamics in some fashion. Hebrews chapter 1, and you might stay there or mark that. We will be coming back to it. Hebrews chapter 1, beginning with verse 1. God, after He spoke long ago to the fathers and the prophets in many portions and in many ways, in these last days, the Christian era, has spoken to us in His Son. What about the Son? Whom He appointed heir of all things, through whom also He made the world. So the Father and the Son in concert created the world. And he is the radiance of his glory and the exact representation of his nature, and upholds all things by the word of his power. Not only is Jesus Savior, but Jesus was involved in creation. And not only was he involved in creation, Jesus continues to uphold all things by the word of his power. That's the first law of thermodynamics. Matter is neither created nor destroyed, neither is energy. They can transform from one form into another. And it is the word of Christ, if you were to talk about it from a spiritual perspective, it is the word of Christ that maintains that constancy that we typically refer to as laws of nature. Thus, the first law of thermodynamics would lean more toward the existence of an eternal spiritual creator who brought all matter and energy into existence, because there is no law in physics that would allow for them to come or go. But that leads us to the next one, which is the second law of thermodynamics. And the second law of thermodynamics, just very simply put, goes like this. Everything runs down. Just had to go get a new cell phone the other day because everything runs down. Why can't you buy a cell phone and it lasts 15 years and you can save a whole lot of money? I don't know, but it doesn't seem to work that way. Everything runs down. The cell phone, the human body, the sun itself, the universe, everything is running down. Now let's put this in very practical terms that me and George Walker can understand very well. And that is this. The second law of thermodynamics goes like this. You go to the grocery store and you buy a bunch of bananas. And you don't get them eaten all before eventually they begin to turn black. And then you eat banana bread. That's the second law of thermodynamics. Everything runs down. Now, think about the universe, if you will, for a moment. Reflecting back. We won't turn back, but reflecting back. I hope you're still in Hebrews 1. Reflecting back to the book of Genesis. After everything God created, what did he say? It was good. Everything he made, it was good. It was made in its pristine form. That's how God made the creation. But then sin entered the world. Death comes upon the physical realm as well as the spiritual. And we see that things begin to run down. And in Hebrews chapter 1, beginning with verse 10, concerning Jesus again, you, Lord, in the beginning laid the foundation of the earth. There's creation. And the heavens are the work of your hands. There's creation. They will perish, but you remain. They all will become old like a garment, and like a mantle you will roll them up. Like a garment they will also be changed, but you are the same, and your years will not come to an end. What do we see about the created universe in Hebrews chapter 1? We see it's growing old. It's growing old. So if you were to ask an atheistic scientist, an evolutionary scientist, and you were to say, okay, now, how did this universe come into existence? Here's the story you would get. Okay, everything that there was compacted itself to the size of about a pencil eraser. And then it became unstable and it exploded. That's the Big Bang. And it exploded and it sprayed matter and energy all around, and it just continues to spread forth from that. And some of the areas of matter and energy, such as where our solar system happens to be, some of the matter and energy collected themselves together, and the sun was the result, and the moon was the result, and the other planets were the result, and all of these things. And thus this solar system came together. That's the Big Bang. But they'll continue, and they'll say, but now what's happening is the universe is continuing to expand. Second law of thermodynamics. The amount of usable energy in the universe and in every system of the universe. Take the sun, for example. It is gradually running down. I don't think it's running down today completely. But everything is running down. But over time, what's going to happen is eventually the matter and energy in the universe, it'll continue to spread out, and the usable nature of that will not be. It'll still exist, first law of thermodynamics, but it won't be in a usable form anymore. everything runs down, everything wears out. Okay, that's right, except the atheist says that happened without a supernatural power. The one who believes in God and creation would say, okay, if there was a big bang, there had to be a big banger. All right, first of all. If there's a big bang, there had to be a big banger. Okay, second of all, God created everything in the form He wanted it to be. It was all good, Genesis chapter 1, and now it's all running down. But what the second law of thermodynamics tells us is, because everything is running down, and there's no purely physical, naturalistic way the universe could have gotten wound up, that leaves what? A non-physical, spiritual being who created all things good, and from that point, it begins to grow old like a garment. The second law of thermodynamics tends toward belief in God and creation. Another I would mention is symbiosis. Symbiosis is the idea of two organisms that rely on each other for existence. Take the honeybee and the flower, for example. Now, the flower cannot exist without the work of the bee in pollination. And the bee cannot exist without the pollen that comes from the flower. Now, how could, in an evolutionary way, how is it possible for a flower to develop and a bee to develop if anywhere in the stages along development, they're not going to be able to do for each other the things that need to be done? So both the bee and the flower had to be made complete to begin with, because there's no evolutionary mechanism how that could have happened. That, in every form of symbiosis, would tend toward belief in a creator God that made all things as they are, to function fully as they do, rather than toward an evolutionary model. But let me mention this one to you. Probability, or you might call it irreducible complexity. Now, used to, the second law of thermodynamics was my favorite extra-biblical scientific evidence for God. This one is now my favorite and has been for quite some time. And let's do it this way. Let's say that there are 5 books you possess, and you want to put these 5 books on the bookshelf in just a certain way. Now, some of you don't care. Bruce, for example. You go to his library, and he has all these amazing books, and you can't find any of them because there's no logic to it whatsoever. Buy these books, put them on this shelf. Buy these books, put them on. Anyway, sorry, Bruce, not really. But you go to my library, and about 50% of the time you can find what you're looking for. Okay, so that's not a whole lot better. But anyway, there's an order. There's an order to it. And if you have in mind a certain order that you want your books to be in, then you place them on the shelf in exactly that way. But let's experiment. Let's say you have these 5 books and you know how you want them on the shelf. But somebody comes in and says, hey, I see these books are lying on the desk. Would you like me to put them on the shelf for you? And you were to say, sure, I would. I want them on that shelf. Now, I want you to guess what order you think I want them in and put them on there in the order I have in mind. That sounds kind of easy. It's only 5 books. Sounds pretty easy, doesn't it? Well, how many ways can you order 5 books on your shelf? Well, mathematicians will tell you that in order to figure that out, you use what they call factorials. And factorials are where you take the number of objects that you have, and I know it looks like you're really excited about, say, the number 6 or the number 5 because it has an exclamation point after it. I know that sounds like you're really excited about that number. That's not really what it is. You would read that 5 factorial. And with factorials, what you do is you take the number of objects that you have, 5 books, and you multiply the numbers. 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1, and that number is 120. So with only 5 books, there are 120 possible orders that you could put them in. In other words, Kelly comes into my office and says, these books, why don't you put these books up? Well, now, honey, why don't you put them on that shelf and just guess what order? there's 120 different possibilities she might put them in. I don't really like the chances of her getting them in exactly the right order that I want them in, probably because she doesn't think like I do, but that's a whole other deal. So probability tells you that when there are a number of objects, there are a number of different possibilities. So 5 books, we have our formula. Our formula would tell us there are 120 different possible orders that you could put them in. And the probability of that happening just by chance, with somebody randomly putting them in order on your shelf, is a 1 out of 120 chance, or a 0.008333333 chance that that'll happen by accident. I don't like my chances. Only 5 objects, but I don't like my chances. But you know what? When you start talking about living organisms, and you consider probability in regard to a living organism just happening by chance, it's a whole lot more than 1 out of 120 possibility. The simplest forms of life have millions of parts. You, in your human body, have approximately 60 trillion cells. Imagine 60 trillion factorial. There's not enough room on the face of the earth to hold all the zeros for how large a number that is. So what are the chances, if purely by chance, of 60 trillion cells coming into a certain order so that there you are? Not likely at all. In fact, we would probably start throwing around words like impossible, wouldn't we? Not likely at all. Consider someone with Down syndrome, for example. Someone with Down syndrome has one small chromosomal issue and have many health issues as a result of that. One small change. Think about all the many possibilities of errors in 60 trillion cells if it's just purely by chance for the arrangement to take place. The evidence leads toward God, the Creator, who made us as we are, rather than random chance as the cause for our existence. But consider the skeletal system. You have 206 bones in your skeletal system. Pretty close. And 206 factorial is a 10 followed by 388 zeros. Now, I want to tell you right now, that's a lot of zeros. You know how I know that? Because I put them all up here on the board. A 1 followed by 388 zeros is going to go something like this. Are we done yet? No? Now we're done. Now, only 206 parts. But let's say that you take the skeletal system, as we say in dominoes, you shake them bones, and then you throw the skeletal system out. You have a 1 in that many chance of those 206 bones lining up exactly right. How probable is that? Not very. That's only 206. Let's go back to the number of cells in your body, 60 trillion. If that is not likely, how likely is 60 trillion factorial? Again, we would throw around words like impossible, but let's go simple again one more time. Michael Behe, in his book, wrote about the mousetrap. Mousetrap is a very simple apparatus. You have a hammer, you have a spring, you have a catch, you have a platform that holds it all, and then you have a holding bar that will allow you to secure the catch, to hold the hammer down, so the spring, which is loaded, can do its work after you put the cheese or the peanut butter or whatever on the catch. Now, it's a very simple apparatus, right? Okay, let's say that you have these few parts, 5 parts. Let's say you have the parts that are fully whole. There they are. And you just take them and you throw them out on the table. What is the probability that those few parts will come together by random chance and be a fully functioning mousetrap? I heard somebody say 0. It's not like a very young voice. And I'm right there with you, okay? Not very likely. Okay, I know where it came from now. It's not very likely that that kind of thing is going to happen. Okay, let's say that you put it in a bag and you shake the bag. It's not going to happen, is it? Now, it's very few parts. Okay, let's take this. Let's say that you have all these parts and you put almost all of them together, but you leave one off. And then you throw it out there, just randomly. What's the likelihood that one part will land in the right place and stick and now the thing will work? It's not going to happen, is it? Okay, let's say you have this. You have all the parts, they're all together, but one of the parts is bent completely out of shape. Everything else is there. Everything else is ready to work, but there's one thing that's bent so out of shape that it won't connect in the fashion that it should. Is it going to work? It's not going to work. It's a lot more complex, even with a few parts, than the 60 trillion cells of your human body. We're talking about numbers that would not only be very unlikely, we would throw around words like impossible. Think about the distance of the earth from the sun. Now, the evolutionist wants to talk about the primordial soup on the face of the earth, and the sun radiated on the primordial soup, and from the primordial soup there arose this critter and that, and eventually some of those crawled out onto land. And in the case of whales, for example, what happened with whales were that they were land animals, then they became sea animals, then they became land animals, and they became sea animals, and that's why they breathe air in the way that they do. Anyway, there are all kinds of explanations that are given for the various things, but let's forget about the primordial soup here for a minute. Let's forget about the chemicals that could theoretically compose a primordial soup. Let's set all that aside. Let's simply talk about this. What is the probability that a sun like that and an earth like that would by random chance end up being in the exact right distance from each other, and orbit and rotation, so that the things on the earth could develop as the evolutionist says they did? We would throw around things like impossibility, would we not? If we were any closer to the sun, you think it's hot now. If we were any further from the sun, we would freeze. We're exactly the right distance for that to work. So when you talk about probability and you talk about matter and you talk about energy, it takes incredible wisdom and power for things to be as they are, because it takes power and intelligence to do what chance cannot. Take this watch, for example. Let's say that we were to take this watch, and it's working. We were to take this watch apart and put all the pieces in a bag, and we were to shake the bag. How long would we have to shake the bag before we could pour out of the bag a fully functioning watch again? Now remember, you have all the parts. We know they work because they're working right now. And you have a receptacle that keeps them in close proximity to one another. And you have unlimited energy to shake the bag and unlimited time to shake the bag. How long would it take before the watch would come back together and work again? Well, it wouldn't happen, would it? Why not? Because it takes more than matter, even the right matter, and energy for this watch to be formed. There has to be an intelligence behind it. Otherwise, it will not be able to happen. You know, Charles Darwin recognized some degree of this himself. And in his book, Origin of Species, page 154, we read this quote: "If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down." So, the eye, or some other part of your body, if it could be demonstrated that numerous successive slight modifications will not allow for the creation by naturalistic matters of the eye, my theory would break down. Well, Mr. Darwin, I would submit to you that your theory has broken down. Why is it that probability, power, and chance, how those things work together so that we are here as we are? Well, it's because there's an intelligence involved in our existence. Now, that evidence is seen in the DNA code. Evolutionist Richard Dawkins of Oxford, one of the most famous evolutionists around, says the machine code of the genes is uncannily computer-like. Okay, he doesn't believe in God. He doesn't believe in creation. He believes DNA happened by random chance. It was a happy accident. It did not happen through any design of a designer. But I want you to notice the language that he uses is machine code, computer-like. Doesn't that speak of a programmer, a designer who could bring it into existence? Certainly so. You put God in the equation, everything changes. We go from random chance and what we would describe as impossibility all of a sudden to here is one, as was described earlier today, who is omniscient, omnipotent, and who in his great intelligence and wisdom and great power can work to make things exactly as he wants them to be, looking so incredibly complex, being so incredibly complex, but working exactly as he would have them work. Anthony Flew was one of the most famous atheists of the last century. He's not been dead all that long, but Anthony Flew was a man who believed so strongly in atheism that he had several debates on the subject. He debated one fella, and the title of the debate is, Does God Exist? And a believer and an atheist debate. Well, he was the atheist. He had another debate with a gospel preacher, and this one was on the debate on the existence of God, creation, and evolution. And the gospel preacher was in favor of God and creation, and Anthony Flew was against the idea of God and against the idea of creation. He had another debate with Gary Habermas, which Sean just mentioned in his lecture a minute ago. By the way, if you want to study the resurrection more deeply, and by the way, that was deep and that was brilliant just a few minutes ago. If you want to study that further, get anything by Gary Habermas. You can get it on your Kindle reader. You can get it off Amazon.com. You can order it anywhere you want to. Go to Half Price Books, my favorite place, and you can get it. But he has a lot of books on that, and it's really good. Well, this fellow debated Habermas. He said that he did not believe in the resurrection. He did not believe in God, and so forth. Well, you know what happened? Over the course of time, this very famous public atheist who stood his ground changed his mind. He says, I now believe, he's dead now, not too long. He says, I now believe there is a God. I now think that the evidence, does point to a creative intelligence. Notice he has the word intelligence capitalized there. Almost entirely because of the DNA investigations. The more we learned about DNA, the more he began to realize this must not have happened randomly, by chance. There must be an intelligence who put all of this together to cause life to exist. Continuing from the same man, we have all the evidence we need for the existence of a God. In our immediate experience, and that only a deliberate refusal to look is responsible for atheism of any variety. And he looked. And he changed his mind. And he began to believe that there was a divine being. I want to talk about another matter with you for just a few moments, and that is the geologic column. Or, as you've probably heard Don Patton say, the record of the rocks. Stephen Meyer, as mentioned earlier, is Cambridge educated. He's a brilliant scientist himself. And concerning Darwin's theory of evolution, he says his theory predicts a long history of gradual divergence from a common ancestor, with the differences slowly becoming bigger and bigger until you get the major differences we have now. That is, in Darwin's theory of evolution, you'll have the first true cells from the primordial soup. And then these first true cells will begin to develop, and as they develop, some will develop in this way, some will develop in that way, so that the ones on that side of this evolutionary tree would be insects and so forth, and the ones on this side of the evolutionary tree would end up being birds and frogs and so forth, and finally us. That's what Darwin's theory of evolution would predict. That's the evolutionary tree in atheistic evolution. Stephen Meyer continues, the fossil evidence, even in his day, Darwin's day, 150 years ago, showed the opposite. The rapid appearance of phylum-level differences in what's called the Cambrian explosion. That is, rather than the evolutionary tree, simple forms of life developing into more complex and different kinds of forms of life, rather what you see is just immediately, here's a critter, here's a critter, here's a critter, here's a critter. And so you have a lot of things coming about in very close proximity of time to one another. Darwin believed, continuing to quote from Stephen Meyer, Darwin believed that future fossil discoveries would vindicate his theory. But that hasn't happened. Actually, fossil discoveries over the last 150 years have turned his tree upside down by showing the Cambrian explosion was even more abrupt and extensive than scientists once thought. So here's the evolutionary view of what should have happened. Simple forms of life, they branch out into different kinds of forms of life, so ultimately you have many different forms of life, plants and animals and humans and all of these things that exist, but we all came from very simple beginnings and we all branched out eventually from that early beginning. But what does the Cambrian explosion show us? When you look at what is actually in the strata of the earth, what you see is during the Cambrian period, you start off with this creature and this creature and this creature and this creature and so forth. All these different kinds of creatures, and then you have variety within the creature species, or within the species that you're looking at. Let me give you an example. For example, you see such things as, just take a dog for example. Okay, it doesn't matter if the dog is the biggest, slobberiest, friendliest, fuzziest, panda bear looking dog in the history of the world, or if it's a Chihuahua. It's still a dog. Okay, that's variety within the species, but it's still a dog. Take human beings. There's not two of us in here that look exactly alike. All of us are different in some ways. Even twins, you can see slight variety within them. But in spite of the fact that we have different colors of skin, different cultural backgrounds, and so forth, we're all human beings. We are all human beings. That's what you see when you look at the record of the rocks themselves. You see the explosion of different forms of life, not the development of one form of life into another. So, oh, wait a minute, now, hold the phone. All right, we got the horse. We have the evolutionary tree of the horse. Guys, that was debunked a long time ago. Just look it up. I'm not even going to talk about it, except to say, look it up. That was debunked a long time ago. That's not even true. The geologic column is more along the lines of what you'd expect in creation. All these different forms of life fully formed early on, rather than one form developing into another. What we see in the rocks is what you'd expect in creation, not what you would expect in evolution. Let's think about rapid fossilization for a moment. Here is a 30-foot tall tree. And you might not can tell from the photograph, but it's upright. And as you look at this tree in its 30-foot that we can see. There's a coal seam. There are different layers of strata. You might can see another coal seam on up the way as you go, but it's in all these different layers of strata. Let me ask you something. If it took millions of years for fossilization to occur, how much of that tree would we be able to see? If each layer was laid down over 10,000 years, 100,000 years, however many years, if it took millions of years for fossilization, how much of that tree would we see? I'd submit to you perhaps none. You know why? Because it would decay. It would rot before fossilization could take place. Yet when an evolutionist looks at the strata, they say, okay, it took so many 100,000 years or so many tens of thousands of years for this layer and this layer and this layer. It couldn't have happened that way. Because if it did, the top would rot off before it ever got covered up. 30 feet tall. Fossilization can happen rapidly, and that is one example of that we can see. Here's another. Here's an ancient sea creature, and it's obviously fossilized. But if you notice something very interesting about this creature as we zoom in just a little bit, this creature is in the process of giving birth. This fossilization had to happen pretty rapidly, or you would not have the process of birth in this creature captured in such a fashion. I hope you can see this. A fern, fossilized fern. Okay now, anybody ever ask you to take care of their plants while they're gone? Okay? Nobody asked me that. Hey Shane, I need you to come water my plants. Oh, okay, you want them not to be living when you get back, right? Now, if you don't water a fern on time, what happens? I mean, it doesn't take long. We have the curl and the fall. Well, this happens so quickly that not only is it not curled, but let's zoom in a little bit. Can you see the ribbing on each one of the parts of this? That fossilization happened quickly, not over millions of years. Here is a memorial that at the time this picture was taken was about 40 years old. Oh, but it takes hundreds of thousands of years for stalactites and stalagmites to be formed. Well, this building in this picture was around 40 years old when that picture was taken. And more impressively, this same building, by the way, you see the young man standing there in a different picture. This is quite impressive. Created within about 40 years. It doesn't take that long if the conditions are right. And then here is a stalagmite with a bat encrusted in the top of it. Now, if you were to get a very close look at that, you would see that there's some skin fossilized. That had to happen pretty quickly, or you would not have that. My friends, I realize that evolutionists look at the created world and they see fossilization and they see the existence of dinosaurs. Talking about that tomorrow night, by the way. They see dinosaurs, they see other things like that, and they read into it millions of years about all of these matters. The reality is that when you look at that or any other thing, there are evidences that would point in the direction of God and creation, not toward a naturalistic evolutionary process for the way things are today. You know, an atheist can look at something like the human eye or a human being, and the atheist looks at that and says, you know what, after millions of years, humans finally developed and here we are. That's about as logical as looking at the sandcastle and saying this sandcastle came up by chance after millions of years of erosion. We know better. The existence of something like that indicates that there had to be an intelligence who made it like that. And the existence of things far more complex, like your eye, like your eardrum, like your entire self, they're not acts of random chance. They are by the hand of a creator God, and the evidence would point toward that. I look at these beautiful children in this picture and the ones that are working with them, and I don't see random chance. I see creatures made in the image of God, who in wisdom made all things good. And we should respect the way that he made the things that he did. Or in the words of the book by Norman Geisler and Frank Turek, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. Oh, not faith in the true sense, but faith in the way that they look at things. I don't have enough faith to be an atheist because the evidence would lean in the other direction. So extra biblical scientific evidence is for God and creation. It is reasonable to believe because of the evidence. Because of the evidence. And I'll close with Hebrews 11 and verse 1. Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction or evidence, things not seen. Why do I believe in God? Why do I believe in creation? Because of the evidence. The evidence of the resurrection of Jesus that Sean talked about. The evidence of the philosophical matters that Bruce has been talking about. The evidence of the Bible as the Word of God that Tyler has been talking about. The evidences. Those are why I believe in God and creation. And believe not in some academic sense, but in the sense of wanting to follow Him wherever He teaches me and in whatever manner He would have me, that I may honor Him who created all things good, who made us in His image, and would have us spiritually grow up in His Son to be like Him. And if this night you've not obeyed the gospel of Christ, God is real. The evidence points toward Him. And I would urge you to believe in Jesus as the resurrected Lord, who left heaven, came to earth, lived as man among men, died on the cross for our sins, and arose from the grave to give us the hope that without Him we could never have. Forgiveness, new birth, opportunity for transformation through His grace to be like Him and to have the hope that we can find with God in heaven throughout all eternity. I would urge you to arise and be baptized and wash away your sins, calling on the name of the Lord, the resurrected Lord. And if we can help you with that, we hope you'll come as we stand and sing.